Hi everyone. This is lesson 1.4 in which we are going to focus some attention on theory formation in sociology. In lesson 1.3 we looked at kind of the guts, so to speak, of the scientific method. Bear in mind that research and theory are the very essence of sociology. If you will notice on page 6 of study guide number 1, I've given you some information about theory. Theory is really an effort, an attempt to explain cause and effect. Theories suggest associations among variables, and theories are designed to explain those particular associations. A theory, you want to remember, has withstood investigation or analysis. We're talking about something that's well supported and testable. It's not just somebody's guess. And that's the difference between a scientific theory and kind of a personal theory. I theorize all the time, but most of the information I employ are just my own biases and insights, none of which have really been tested as such. Emile Durkheim, one of the major contributors to the formation of the discipline of sociology, constructed a theoretical model aimed at explaining what appears to be a very personal and private act: suicide. During the time that he completed his research in the late 19th century in France, the assumption, the thinking was that if anybody commits suicide, it's the result of psychological problems or disorders. That kind of thinking is still around today. You got to be crazy to commit suicide. But Durkheim's research focused on the fact that a better explanation of suicide is to focus on suicide rates rather than individual acts of suicide. So he engaged in the first really large-scale analysis of existing data resources. He focused on documents, official statistics, and the like. And he came to the conclusion that if the common sense thinking of the time were correct, that only crazy people or people with psychological disorders commit suicide, then suicide would be distributed randomly among a population. But his research of statistical-based records kept by government agencies, hospitals, mental institutions, and the like, he noted that suicide varies based upon a number of key factors. Some of those included, and this isn't an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination, marital status, gender, religion, and social change. He also reasoned that if the common sense-based explanation was correct, that again, only people with psychological problems commit suicide, then wouldn't it make sense that rates of suicide would be high among categories of people who were overrepresented in mental hospitals or institutions? Yet his research discovered that although more women than men were in mental institutions, for every woman that committed suicide, 4 men did. And as to religious categories in the France of his time, Jews exhibited the highest rate of psychological disorders, but had the lowest rate of suicide. What Durkheim did is to practice the sociological imagination. He put into action the sociological perspective. And based upon his analysis and study, he reasoned that suicide can't be considered to be strictly an individual act. He argued there's a social basis to suicide. The action can be significantly influenced by social factors or elements. Think of these factors or elements as making up the independent variable. He noted 2 in particular: social integration and dramatic and rapid change. Social integration really refers to social ties, social connections, a sense of cohesion or a feeling of belonging. Social integration, he argued, plays a significant role in two types of suicide that he identified. In all, he identified 4 types. One he called egoistic. It results from limited or too little social integration. A person doesn't feel plugged in, so to speak, or attached socially. They don't really have a sense of meaning or purpose. They may feel isolated, detached from others and from society as a whole. And if they happen to be confronted by some serious crisis, they only have their own individually based resources to fall back upon. A key psychological indicator of this type is depression. Some examples include divorced, unmarried, and widowed people are more likely not to have strong social connections as compared to married couples. So it comes as no real surprise. People who are divorced, unmarried, widowed tend to have higher rates of suicide than people who are married. Durkheim also discovered that Catholics generally have lower rates of suicide than do Protestants. But both of these categories of Christians view suicide negatively. He highlighted the fact that Protestantism emphasizes individual salvation, responsibility, and a relationship with God. Catholicism, on the other hand, as well as Judaism, emphasizes very important and significant rituals. These provide a strong sense of community. Followers or believers are bound to a belief system through doctrine and ritual. It's possible to argue that suicide is one of those costs, so to speak, that people pay as a result of having a great deal of personal freedom. I sometimes think of the character Hamlet in Shakespeare's famous play about the melancholy Dane. Hamlet was literally again depressed. His father had been murdered by his uncle, and his uncle, Hamlet's uncle, had turned around and married Hamlet's mother. There's that famous line he utters in the play, "To be or not to be, that is the question." Again, possible example of egoistic-based suicide. The second type he noted is altruistic, which is the flip side of egoistic. It's 180 degrees different, so to speak. This results from too high a degree or too much social integration. The person excessively identifies with the values, the beliefs, or perhaps the causes of the group or society. They become so strongly integrated into the group or the cause, they lose their personal identification. Some psychological indicators might include a sense of obligation, as well as shame and guilt. The latter is usually associated with the idea, I haven't committed to the group or to the cause in the way that I should have. I've let the group down. Some examples. Ritual suicide. Seppuku was practiced by some samurai in medieval Japan when they believed they had dishonored their lord or leader. I'm sure all of you have heard of military leaders who have committed suicide following a defeat in battle. This particular type of suicide lends itself to a better understanding of suicide bombers. Another and very interesting key element to understanding suicide, according to Durkheim, another important independent variable, so to speak, is dramatic change. It forms the basis for a third type of suicide that he identified as anomic. Anomic implies no sense of social order. In other words, sudden, significant change disrupts society. Social regulation goes kind of crazy. Put another way, the dramatic change confuses, makes ineffective social norms. Social norms, and we'll discuss this particular concept in much greater detail when we get into an analysis of culture, Think of social norms as just rules of the game. They're behavioral guidelines. Some are very general. You might even think of them as more along the lines of just customary behavior. You shouldn't pick your nose and flip, for example. On the other hand, some norms are so centrally important they become the basis of a society's legal system. You violate them, you get into serious trouble. For example, abusing sexually a child, robbery, murder. But dramatic social change can sometimes screw up these norms, make them ineffective. Some psychological indicators of this type of suicide would include insecurity, disillusionment, confusion as to how someone should behave. Some examples that perhaps some of you are familiar with in history might include stockbrokers and others who lost everything in the great stock market crash in the late 20s, rushed to the top of skyscrapers and threw themselves off because they simply couldn't cope with a life of not having anything. You probably also have heard of people who have committed suicide following the death of a spouse or the loss of a job. I sometimes think of the old con in the film Shawshank Redemption. He spent most of his life incarcerated. He finally gets parole, gets to a halfway house, and suddenly he cannot cope with his new won freedom. He just doesn't know how to behave, and he commits suicide. Now, these changes that I'm addressing here can sometimes be quite positive. They can carry with them genuine benefits. Maybe some of you quickly recognize this gentleman. It's Kurt Cobain of the band Nirvana. Some have argued that he and his band were an overnight success, and a factor among many that could have contributed to his suicide is that he had real difficulty adjusting to all the trappings of fame. A fourth category, identified by Durkheim, he entitled fatalistic. This results from too much regulation. The result is a loss of freedom and the absence of any sense of choice. As he points out, a person literally loses the capacity to dream. The result is the person feels lost. There's nowhere to turn. There's no hope. They're just trapped. Some psychological indicators could include fear and resignation. There are some examples that you might contemplate. Slaves committing suicide. Likewise, maybe you are familiar with the fact that some people who have become invalids feel trapped by their circumstances and commit suicide. Prisoners in concentration camps. I sometimes think of the character Rose in the film Titanic. She felt trapped. She was being forced into a loveless marriage by her very pushy mother, who wanted to maintain their elite social and economic status. She just felt like her life was being dictated to by others. And if you remember the film, she contemplated suicide only to be rescued at the last moment by Jack. Now, remember, Durkheim's model doesn't tell us why a particular person may commit suicide. But his analysis does note that the likelihood of committing suicide decreases with the degree to which one is connected to others. Also, his research highlights the fact that suicide is not randomly distributed over a population or a society, but it's going to vary from one social category to another, or based upon social processes, like some of those that we examined. His model also highlights that change and its impact upon social norms might be a player in one's decision to consider or to commit suicide. Now, my hope is that this investigation will help you better appreciate the role of theory in sociology. As a matter of fact, a way of kind of tying up some loose ends is to look at what's included at the top of the 7th page with respect to integration and regulation and how these tie into the 4 types that he identified. Next time, we're going to investigate further some difficulties and ethical concerns associated with completing scientific research. And we're also going to take theory one step further and elaborate on theoretical perspectives in sociology.